middle school and high school is a tough time for these girls.
Oh my God, it's the worst.
Don't fit the mold. Yeah. And instead of telling these girls, you're going to get through this, and becoming a woman is amazing, and it may seem scary right now, but we all got through it, and it's going to be okay. Yeah. They're telling these girls a horrible message that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, which what girl doesn't during puberty, it could be because you're trans. Yeah. That is a horrible, disgusting, evil message to be sending any young girl, that they could possibly be born wrong. And a lot of these parents, as I stated before, are being lied to by doctors, and shame on these doctors, because they are pushing junk pseudoscience that doesn't even resemble medicine.
Meet January Littlejohn. She is with donoharm.org, donoharmmedicine.org. She's a mother and has an amazing experience to share, and a lot of knowledge about the transgender ideology that is pervasive these days. Welcome to the Michele Tafoya podcast. Please subscribe. We'd love to have you on board for every interview. We work really hard at getting interviews that are relevant, interesting for you, and meaningful. And this one is very much so. I had an eating disorder when I was 13, pretty much 13 to 14 years old. I got down to an incredibly unhealthy weight. And part of that had to do with me just not accepting my own body. Anorexia is a bit of a mental health issue. You could say that many, 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 many kids who go through gender dysphoria go through it in their adolescence at a very difficult time when their body is changing and they are uncomfortable. And it's tough to get through. That doesn't mean they're going to be a transgender, but a lot of these kids are preyed upon. And that's what happened to January Littlejohn's 13-year-old daughter at school. The tale is a little bit horrifying. The outcome is positive. And it's so important to understand what's actually going on, because I don't think the individual children are being looked at as people to be cared for. I think they're looked at as people who can be controlled. You'll hear it all in this episode. Again, please subscribe. We'd love to have you on board. January Littlejohn is next. January, welcome. It's good to have you with us to give your side. This has been a beginning of a presidency with a lot of executive orders, and the one that Trump signed recently, saying no more federal tax dollars being put toward these transgender surgeries for youth, meaning chemical, physical operations, surgeries, that kind of thing. It seems like such a no-brainer to me. But we actually needed an executive order. What did you make of what he signed?
Well, this is an important first step in protecting vulnerable kids like my daughter. My daughter fell prey to this ideology, to this lie that she was born in the wrong body back in 2020 at the height of COVID. And this was shortly after 3 of her friends at the local middle school had also suddenly started identifying as some form of transgender. And I think it's important for your audience to understand why these executive orders were necessary. And it's because a radical ideology known as gender identity ideology had infiltrated not just our schools, but our medical field. My own profession as a counselor, my counseling field had also been infiltrated. And so these orders are necessary because we saw these girls like my daughter being seduced by an ideology into believing that the only way to cure their distress was to go on this medical pathway. And it's really, really important that your audience understands that not only were these kids being fed lies, that they have a so-called gender identity that's separate from their sex, that they choose to be a boy, girl, neither or both, because a lot of people still don't quite understand what was being taught. But that this lie then leads them, in my case, they socially transition my daughter at school without our knowledge or consent. And that's the first step toward medical transition.
Yeah. So I just want to interrupt because I want to ask who they are. When you say they socially transitioned my daughter at middle school, who are they?
So our daughter had gone to the school counselor and wanted to go by a different name and pronouns. And of course, here in 2025, we know a lot more than we knew in 2020. A lot of parents didn't even know at the time that this ideology had infiltrated the schools. And so when my daughter got into the car and said, Mom, I had a meeting about my name, because I naively thought it would be treated like a nickname. We were aware that our daughter was struggling. We had elicited the help of a counselor to help us as parents navigate this issue. Because back in 2020, and even still today, when you Google this as a parent, and mind you, I have a background in counseling. And so I knew that what I was seeing in my daughter's friend group and with my own child was not correlating with how I was trained in this issue clinically. But when you Google this issue, the only information that a parent would find at that time was to affirm your child in any identity he or she chooses, or your child's going to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And
we heard that a lot. Would you rather have a living daughter or a dead son?
Right.
Yeah.
And that lie is enough to bring a parent to their knees. That is a parent's worst nightmare. And so when my daughter got into the car and told me that she had had a meeting at school and they asked her which restroom she wanted to use, that's really what propelled us down this path that we were completely unprepared for. So to make a long story short, because we have a short amount of time, my daughter was placed on one of these social transition plans. It took us a long time to even find out what they had done with my daughter, but they sat my 13-year-old child down behind closed doors with 3 adults that consisted of the school counselor, a social worker I had never met, and the vice principal. And in these gender support plans, which are social transition plans, anybody can look them up online. They're from an organization called Gender Spectrum, but it goes well beyond name and pronouns. They ask the children which name and pronoun they prefer to use, which restroom and locker room they prefer to use, and which sex they would like to room with on overnight field trips. They also put the burden of whether or not a parent will be notified of the meeting or participate in the meeting on the minor child. So you have instances, and I've spoken to parents all over our country, where everybody at the school knows this child is struggling because, Michele, I'm sure you know by now, most of these children have co-occurring mental health issues. Mm-hmm. These are not healthy children that are falling prey to this ideology. And so you have instances where everybody in the school knows this child is struggling, living a double life, except for the people that know and love their child the most, which are the parents.
You know, it's crazy. I'm listening to a book about communism and socialism and Marxism back in the kind of that mid 1940s to late 1950s time. And they talk about how kids, because they spend so much time at school, were indoctrinated by their teachers in certain topics. And it does seem like the schools have become these places where they know they have a captive audience. And to tell the child, we're not going to tell your parents, it's up to you to tell your parents, and this is our little secret if you don't want to tell them, is to me outrageous. As a parent of 2 kids, it's outrageous. So your daughter did come to you and tell you that she had the meeting. What happened next? So much uncertainty in the world, whether it's what the relationship with China, which is a hostile nation toward the West, things we know and things we don't know. So why gamble with your financial future? That's the one thing you really can take some control over and have some agency. You know, no matter who is in office and who is pulling the strings in Washington, you do have the ability to control your wealth protection. I want you to look into American Independence Gold, and you can do that by just going to tafoyagold.com, Tafoya gold.com. Relying solely on digital systems or banks, that's a risk you can't afford to take. Here's a phone number as well if you want to call, 833-324-4653. For generations, gold and silver have been the ultimate safe haven. and they've weathered wars and market crashes and all kinds of things. It's about taking control of your financial future, not just the owning of the gold, but really controlling your future. It's a proud veteran-owned company, American Independence Gold. So they go the extra mile by supporting military families. A portion of all of their proceeds goes to Tunnel to Towers Foundation, which is one of the great veteran and first responder supporting organizations in America. If you want to secure your future, check out American Independence Gold. Just go to tafoyagold.com, TAFOYA gold.com. You can also call 833-324-4653, 833-324-4653. You'll also find all of this in the show notes, tafoyagold.com, TAFOYA gold.com.
Well, I was very concerned. I was concerned that they were asking my child questions that would have absolutely affected her safety. So I reached out to the guidance counselor. You know, my daughter also has diagnosed ADHD, so she has a 504 plan. And Michelle, I want to make it very clear. The school knew me. I was volunteer of the year at this school. I was up volunteering at that school at least 10 hours per week. I ran their copy room. So not only was I up at the school, I was a substitute teacher in the district. I was doing all of the things that an involved parent does. And so if it can happen to our family, it can happen to any family. But what was so egregious in these plans is they also asked the child, how should we refer to you when speaking to your parents? Should we use your birth name and pronouns or your new name? And this is to effectively deceive parents that these social transitions had ever happened. And so when I reached out, you have to remember this is the height of COVID. And so a lot of people are so soon to forget how crazy and chaotic that time was. We were not allowed on school campus. This was fall of 2020. So I was called back with the assistant principal and the guidance counselor, whom I had met with many times before. And I was told they could not give me any information about the secret meeting they had with my daughter because my daughter was now protected by a non-discrimination law. And so I did a deep dive into this issue, Michelle. And what I realized is our school system had been infiltrated by an activist organization called Equality Florida starting in 2016. They had a whole department within their organization called Safe Schools, and they approached the schools under the guise of non-discrimination and anti-bullying policies.
See, this, hang on to your thought. I just want to point out how lovely and nice all that terminology sounds. What did you say? Equality Florida and Safe Schools. It's like the Inflation Reduction Act. They'll call anything to disguise what's really in it. And I think that is sinister and gross. And I think that needs to be pointed out because the average person would say, oh, Equality Florida, that sounds like a great organization. Not knowing and not having done the deep dive that you did. Go ahead.
That's right. And so what we found was, my husband and I continued to ask for legal justification for them meeting with our 13-year-old daughter without our knowledge or consent. And we were finally shown this LGBTQ guide. And it turns out my county, thankfully these guides have now been rescinded, but my county, Leon County, was not the only county that had these guides. There were about at least 12 to 15 other counties that had these similar guides that had been put in place. And in these guides, it explicitly stated that outing a child when it comes to their transgender status to their parents can cause abuse or make them homeless. And so this lie had really taken root. Also in these guides, schools were being instructed that minor children had a right to privacy from their parents. That is not true.
So that is, the schools were being told that, but that's not a fact.
That's correct. And what was so interesting is no one was using any kind of critical thinking because as a counselor, and as a teacher, we are mandated reporters. You can't legally presume all parents to be an enemy or a danger to their children with no due process. And that's exactly what was happening.
God, that's
and
a good
certainly
point.
happened in my case.
That's
we
such
were
a great
unilaterally
point.
cut out of a critical decision that they allowed my 13-year-old daughter to make on her own with no parent there to keep her safe. They completely took my ability to keep my child safe from me.
This is what really needs to be pointed out, that what they do is they go, well, you know what, the parent might really disagree. Like, for instance, I'm looking at, there's a platform online, and maybe it used to be a magazine, I don't know, called Advocate. And, you know, they call you out as an anti-trans activist who just hates trans people. You know, this is not about that. This is about a parent's involvement with their child. This is what this really comes down to. And to just assume that a parent is going to harm or kick a child out of the house because of this issue is a massive leap. And like you said, based on no due process. I don't know. How did they get away with this?
Well, what I will say is that I have never met a parent that has kicked their child out of their home or abused their home. This ideology is so destructive. And what schools are really doing, Michele, it's parental alienation. When the school interfered in the way that they did with our daughter, it sent a very clear message to our child that our parental authority was no longer wanted or needed, and that she needed to be protected from us, not by us. No one loves a child like their parents. And we have lost our rightful role in our children's lives. We have abdicated our parental authority, and there has been a steady erosion on parental rights for quite some time. And 2020 was a huge wake up, not just for me, but for parents all over the country, because they saw what was being taught in the schools. They saw that parents were being cut out of these critical conversations with their children. Think about that. The Supreme Court has long said that we have a fundamental right to direct the upbringing of our children, which includes the mental and physical health. And what these social transition plans are is a psychosocial medical intervention that schools are grossly unqualified to be doing.
So just because it's cold outside doesn't mean you need to stop grilling. Oh, no way. It's so much fun to grill in the cold, and not if you have the right grill, right? If you have the right grill, grilling outside is a blast, and that would be a Solaire infrared grill. Solaire infrared grills heat up in just 3 minutes. Trust me, it sounds fast because it is fast. They perform equally well in the cold winter as in the heat of summer, and they grill the food really fast. So it's not like you have to stand out there and, spend a bunch of time anyway. The Solaire infrared grills heat your food directly, not the air around the food like conventional grills do. The intense heat also results in the juiciest, tastiest food you will ever have from any kind of grill, gas, charcoal, or otherwise. To get the great taste, it's all in the heat, in Solaire infrared from besthotgrill.com. It gets hotter than anything you've ever experienced during the actual grilling season. So try the Solaire infrared grill now with the demo program. Don't be left out in the cold. No, learn more about USA-made Solaire infrared grills at besthotgrill.com. Besthotgrill.com. I am speaking from experience. This thing makes great food. besthotgrill.com.
So we did end up it was over a year later, we made the difficult decision to not only go public with our story because we felt that other parents needed to be warned. I was very concerned, not just from a parent perspective, but from a mental health counselor perspective about the stress that this would place on a child living a double life. And it turns out my instincts were right. There was a 12-year-old girl in Clay County that attempted suicide on school campus because of the stress that living the double life caused her. And so we did file a federal lawsuit. Unfortunately, it was dismissed in December of 2022, and we are now appealing the judge's ruling at the 11th Circuit Court. But you have to understand, even though we now have good laws in Florida, these lawsuits take many years. And in the meantime, families are still being destroyed by this ideology. Children are being brainwashed to believe that their parents don't love them if they don't affirm this lie. And what we're talking about, Michele, is my daughter was celebrated by teachers and administrators and her peers for wanting to cut her breast off. This ideology is so evil. It causes these children to not only disassociate from their bodies, very similar to eating disorders, but it also affirms in their mind that something is wrong with them.
Yes.
And
so
the only way to relieve that distress is to go on unproven puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and undergo radical surgical interventions that really resemble Frankenstein surgeries.
When you said eating disorders, I was thinking, and this is my only experience. I was anorexic, okay, at 13 years old.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay, because look, I'm alive. My parents got me through it. Thank God for my family, right? Who they intervened. I think some people at school also talked to my parents about this, but very little was known about anorexia nervosa back when I had it. But the pain that I was in and the wanting to disassociate myself from my physical being was so hefty. And you know what? It's something that you never get over. Like I always tell people I'm a recovering anorexic because it still lives in me. I'm still constantly punishing myself for the way my body looks sometimes. It's a blessing and a curse. But when you're 13, I mean, I can remember myself a little bit back then. I'm in no position to make my parents had to force me to see a doctor. And that was the turning point for me when a medical physician finally intervened and said, girl, you got to eat, or you're going to kill yourself. Yeah. So.
And imagine if you had been affirmed.
Right.
And you're distorted thinking about your body and your self-hate. Yeah, imagine if that instead had been celebrated and you were offered diet pills and liposuction.
Yes.
I mean, that is really what this is.
Yeah.
And so when I really fully understood and you pull back the curtain from gender affirming care, which doesn't even resemble ethical healthcare.
Right.
I was absolutely horrified. I was fearful. And I speak to parents every week, parents of children and young adults who are undergoing these interventions or want them because they feel like this is going to cure their distress. And it is absolutely heartbreaking. I relive the trauma of what my family went through every week when I'm contacted by parents going through this same nightmare. I'm one of the lucky ones, Michele.
Yeah. What happened? How did this story continue? I'd love to know what you're willing to share about your family's story and about your daughter.
Sure. So I'm very protective over my daughter's privacy.
Sure. Understood.
Being an adolescent girl in today's time is really hard anyway. And to have this on top of that it's been challenging. And she feels, she still carries a lot of shame over what happened, even though this wasn't her fault. It's the adults in her life that should have known better and not done what they did to her. But thankfully, after about 2.5 years, she came through this confusion. And that is my message to parents, that the vast majority of these kids, if you do not socially or medically transition them, they will come through this identity crisis because that's exactly what it is. And so it's really important for parents to hear that message of hope, to know that they can get their child through this, but it does take radical steps. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You have to be willing to sit in conflict with your child, which unfortunately a lot of parents aren't willing to do today. And you cannot outsource this issue. There are many therapists who are not safe to bring your child to.
Yeah.
And so it's really a tricky time for parents, but there are many resources that we have now that were not available back in 2020 when this happened to our daughter, including where I have, where I'm a senior fellow, which is Do No Harm. You can get parent resources at donoharmmedicine.org. And there are so many places that are willing to stand by parents, help them walk their child through this confusion, and let them know that they are not alone.
It is the most important job you will ever have, that of a parent. It is the toughest job you will ever have because as you love your child so much, that you want to avoid conflict, that you want
Right.
everything to be happy all the time, that you want it to be fun, you want to be their best friend, you love them so much. If you care about them and their future, you have to remember that you're raising a human being who needs to function in this world. This isn't going to be a child forever. And so you've got to get through the tough stuff, and it's difficult. It's really, really hard. But there's no other way. And I've heard a stat, maybe you can correct me, January, of 4 out of 5 kids with gender dysphoria will grow out of it. You know, that's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah, it is. And unfortunately, a lot of the research we have was based on true gender dysphoria, Michelle, and most of these kids do not fall into that cohort.
Right. This is a social contagion, it feels
That's
like,
correct.
right? Yeah.
That is absolutely correct. There's no other explanation for the sharp increase in girls that are identifying as some form of transgender. And again, you have this ideology that's being taught. So it's not just someone identifying as the opposite sex. You have girls thinking that they're non-binary, gender fluid. There are over 72 very catchy identities for these kids to choose from, many of which have their own flags, their own colors. And then, kids are being taught they choose pronouns, like you're choosing an accessory or a pair of earrings. And it's all leading down this destructive medical pathway. You cannot divorce those two issues. And so when people say, oh, it's just kind to affirm, just use their name and pronoun. No. You are affirming in that child's mind that something is wrong with them. Yeah. That is not kind, and that is not compassionate. The most compassionate thing a parent can do is love and support their child, stand in truth, and help them accept the reality of their sex. Because all children deserve to grow into adulthood with their bodies and their fertilities intact. I think the vast majority of Americans are already on this side of reason, which is why I think President Trump won. But I think even more would be on this side if they fully understood that we are running unregulated experiments on vulnerable children. Up to 40% of these children are on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
I think if they really understood what these puberty blockers are doing, that once you place a child on puberty blockers, 98% of them will go on to cross-sex hormones and then potential surgical interventions. The other thing that I will say is for a very long time, these hospitals lied and stated they were not doing surgeries on minors. We know definitively that is a lie. StopTheHarmDatabase.com actually is showing the hospitals that are doing these surgical interventions and hormonal interventions on children. And so I think that if people fully understood that we were cutting the breast off of girls as young as 12 years old, this would have stopped a long time ago.
We have had guests on this show of detransitioners. And there are, I'm so grateful for their courage, because many of them, Chloe Cole, are coming out and saying, I have so much regret, and now I may never have the life that I wanted. There is so much more life after the teen years than there is during the teen years. It's as though people want to make that so easy and smooth that they forget about the cost and the part on the other side. And these detransitioners, that the thought that they may not ever be able to have children now, and they're growing into their 20s and 30s with a totally different. It's so painful to see. And when you said that your daughter still lives with a lot of shame, I literally have tears, because that is, it's not her fault. No. And how do you feel about her future? People ask me all the time, does sleep cream work? And all I can tell you is from the emails I get from listeners and from my own experience, yes, it does. And it's risk-free to give it a try. If you're having trouble sleeping, you don't need a drug. You don't need a prescription. What you need is this sleep cream. It's a cream. It's a topical. You just apply it at bedtime. I put it on my forearms, the insides of my forearms, maybe the insides of my elbows. And I was skeptical because this is a CBD based product. And I thought, this really? Now I'm a believer, and I'd love for you to give it a try. And if you don't experience good results, your money will be refunded, guaranteed. You don't even have to send anything back. All right. It smells really good too, which kind of adds an aromatherapy to your evening as you relax and fall asleep. You can find them at sleepcream.com, with cream spelled CREME, sleepcream.com. Again, try for a couple nights, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, your refund is guaranteed. Sleepcream.com, sleep, CREME.com. It's right there on the screen. You can find it in the show notes. And for the next few weeks, use the code GAMEDAY to get free standard shipping on your first order. Game Day at checkout. Sleepcream.com for your best sleep ever. Sleep, CREME.com. How do you feel about her future?
Her future is bright. She's gifted, which is, one of the things that happens with these girls. They're all very similar. It's not the captain of the cheerleading squad that this ideology is capturing. It's the quirky, really smart girls like my daughter that are unique, that are going to be amazing one day in their uniqueness. But middle school and high school is a tough time for these girls. Oh my
God, it's the worst.
That don't fit the mold. Yeah. And instead of telling these girls, you're going to get through this, and becoming a woman is amazing, and it may seem scary right now, but we all got through it, and it's going to be okay. Yeah. They're telling these girls a horrible message that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, which what girl doesn't during puberty, it could be because you're trans. Yeah. That is a horrible, disgusting, evil message to be sending any young girl, that they could possibly be born wrong.
And I want to point out that the disgusting part of the message is not that they could be trans. We're not disgusted by people who are adults, Caitlyn Jenner, who choose to change the trajectory of their lives. What's disgusting is that you're preying on a teenager at the most vulnerable time of their life, telling them they were born in the wrong body, telling them that what they are isn't right, isn't good enough, isn't enough.
That's right. And a lot of these parents, as I stated before, are being lied to by doctors, and shame on these doctors, because they are pushing junk pseudoscience that doesn't even resemble medicine. If you look at WPATH, they call them standards of care, but these were never standards of care because they're not evidence-based. Yeah. Read the WPATH files, read the CAS review. We have so much evidence that tells us this is not good medicine. The risk far outweigh the benefits. And you brought up adults, and, Do No Harm's mission is solely focused on minors. But my personal belief system is we need to look at what is true, what is reality. And the first line of treatment, even for adults, in my professional opinion, should be psychotherapy to help someone feel comfortable in the reality of their sex. If it's bad medicine for a 17-year-old, it's not good medicine for a 22-year-old. It's still affirming a lie, and it's still poisoning their body with hormones that will lead to all kinds of negative consequences. And so I think people lose sight of that when they talk about adults. And I will tell you, parents of young adults are just as devastated and scared for their children's future as parents of teenagers.
Yeah. The resource is important here. So do no harm medicine is it org or .com? .org.
And then stopthedatabase.com, because parents need to know what hospitals they can trust and which they can't. They should not be giving any of their money or putting their child in the care of doctors that are going to indoctrinate their child or ask them questions. And that's the other thing that I will tell your audience. Parents have got to take back their authority in every institution in their child's life. And if you are not going to be recognized as the ultimate decision maker for your child, you should not be taking your child there, whether it's the school, a doctor's office. You need to opt out of all of these mental health screenings and questions about gender and, sexual orientation. That is not the job of the doctor. You're there to give your child a physical. Yep. And so parents need to take back that authority and make it very clear, do not talk to my child about this, and fully inoculate their younger children. That's really the only way we're going to fully win this battle, because it's not a matter of if they're exposed to this ideology, it's when, because it's in children's programming, it's in social emotional learning. And I know that the Trump administration has an executive order for schools that I haven't fully read yet. But just pulling the federal funding doesn't mean that states can't go, okay, well, we're not going to take federal funding, but we're going to continue to indoctrinate our children in our school systems. And so it's important that parents are fully engaged, teaching their children the truth. There are two sexes. Sex is binary. And regardless of what one does to their physical characteristics, that can never change. And so we can and should have compassion for those struggling with distress over their sex, but we should not affirm a lie in any circumstance.
January Littlejohn, it's just such a pleasure to talk to you. I am pulling for your daughter, and I hope every one of these doctors gets sued. Every one of these doctors that performs this crap gets sued.
Yes, and whistleblowers. It's really important right now with these executive orders. Dr. Eitan Haim is a hero because when Dallas Children said they weren't doing it anymore and they were absolutely doing it, I think that that's going to happen now, where a hospital is going to publicly say that they are following the executive orders so they can continue to get federal funding. But we are going to need brave whistleblowers that will be protected now under this administration to come forward and let them know if they are continuing to medically abuse these children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate your time so much. Again, it is donoharmmedicine.org. It's in the show notes as well. So check it out. January, thank you so much. She's a perfect example of being brave and doing good. And that's how I end the podcast every time. Be brave, do good, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Michelle.
I stand here not just for my family, but for the countless families whose children are falling prey to the lies of gender identity ideology. In the spring of 2020, our 13-year-old daughter told us she no longer felt like a girl. She had expressed no signs of confusion, and her announcement came shortly after 3 friends at her middle school also suddenly identified as transgender. Soon afterward, her mental health spiraled. It was clear from conversations with our daughter that she was anxious and confused, and it's no surprise why. We learned gender ideology teaches children the pseudoscientific idea that they have a so-called gender identity, which is completely separate from their biological sex. Through this false belief system, they are taught they can choose to be a boy, girl, neither, or both. Gender identity ideology has normalized what is ultimately a psychiatric issue that has infiltrated every aspect of our culture, which is why we are now seeing an explosion of teens falsely believing they are born in the wrong body. The vast majority of these children have a history of trauma or have co-occurring mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and up to 40% are on the autism spectrum. Once a child is led down this path, it begins with a request to change their name and pronouns, clothing, and hairstyle. It then quickly escalates to requests for breast binders, puberty blockers, hormones, and even surgeries. Healthy young girls in our country as young as 12 years old are having their breasts removed in the name of gender identity. Other life-altering medications, which are experimental and often sterilizing, are being carried out under the guise of healthcare. Our daughter at 13 was encouraged through activism and peer pressure to disassociate from her body and to believe her body parts could simply be removed, modified, or replaced. She cavalierly talked about puberty blockers and getting a double mastectomy that has been rebranded as top surgery, but it was clear to us that she did not understand the gravity or scope of what she was requesting. The irreversible consequences of medical transitioning, including loss of sexual and reproductive function, cannot be fully understood by children or teens who lack the necessary cognitive maturity or experience to make these decisions. Not one of these children have the ability to give informed consent. Yet doctors tell us to follow the child's lead. Where else in medicine do we follow a child's lead toward irreversible medical harm? The answer is nowhere. I have spoken to parents across the country who are emotionally blackmailed with the same question. Do you want a live son or a dead daughter? This lie manipulates parents into making irreversible decisions for their children out of fear. Let me be clear. There is no evidence that medical transition is the only alternative to suicide for dysmorphic children. None. What children need is not drastic and unproven medical interventions. They need to be told the truth. They need to go through puberty so their brains and bodies can fully mature. They need love, support, and a chance to grow into themselves. The compassionate treatment is to help these children feel comfortable in their bodies. And that's exactly the path we took with our daughter.